This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. Corruption is perpetrated day in and day out against citizens by crooked politicians and civil servants who enjoy positions of power. So writes Frank Vogl in a new book, Waging War on Corruption. He points out the problem is everything from the head of state who demands millions of dollars in payoffs for government contracts to local officials who extort cash payments from poor people in exchange for small business permits or even just a bed in a local hospital. I sat down with Frank Vogl and asked him just how pervasive corruption is around the world.
It's a universal problem. It affects tens of millions of people, and therefore it's a major reason why we have as much poverty in the world as we do. We find that people, very ordinary people, be they in the streets of Egypt, be they in the streets of Nairobi in Kenya, or in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you name it. Ordinary people are finding they have to pay bribes to get basic services that should be paid for by the state. We have it in the United States. We have an enormous amount of money, a lot of it anonymous, in the US election campaign that's taking place right now. And that has an ugly smell to it as well. Corruption is the abuse of power by politicians and public officials for their benefit at the expense of the public.
And one of the things that comes through in your book is a sense of not just looking at corruption as sort of the price to be paid for doing development work or whatever, but rather a real sense of frustration and anger at complacency, of not wanting to accept corruption as inevitable.
We saw in the so-called Arab Spring in January of 2011, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, how tens of thousands of people went out into the street to face the guns and the brutality of the security forces because they'd reached that point where they felt that the illegitimate governments, they saw them as illegitimate, they saw them as highly corrupt, were day after day abusing their dignity, abusing their self-respect. That constant effort to extort bribes from them for every type of service was demeaning, and they'd had enough. And what we see increasingly over the whole world, we've seen it, mass demonstrations even in Belarus, we've seen tens of thousands of people turn out in Pakistan, in India, in Iran. We've seen people go out, face enormous personal danger to demonstrate against the abuse of their self-respect. And corruption lies at the heart of that.
And it can be forgotten that the spark of the Arab Spring came from a Tunisian fruit and vegetable dealer, Mohamed Bouazizi, who basically was put in a position where the local police were forcing him to pay bribes, and he just couldn't come up with the money, and he wasn't able to make a living for his family.
It's hard for many people to understand the degree of personal abuse, the degree of indignity, the degree to which one feels one's lost one's own self-respect by having to pay these bribes day after day. He went to obviously extreme lengths, but people all over the world are terribly frustrated by this. And my book tries to not only talk about the victims and also the villains, the people who take the bribes, but also those civil society activists, the leaders, what I call the heroes, who are risking their lives, the investigative journalists who are bringing corruption to the fore, the public prosecutors in many countries who are very brave, who are taking on sometimes the most powerful politicians in the country. These are the heroes without whom we would not be talking about the possibility of successes in a war against corruption. A war, I think, that embraces almost every country in the world today.
Now, you look at the book not only at the kind of petty corruption that happens with the local policeman who may be looking for a bribe to look the other way on some violation of a law, or even to allow somebody to do what is their right and legal something to do, but also the corruption on a grand scale that happens when you have rulers who are enriching themselves and impoverishing whole nations.
We see that, and that was, of course, one of the major reasons why President Mubarak was ousted in Egypt. There was that perception amongst the Egyptian people that he and his cronies, his family, his immediate entourage were stealing enormous amounts of public funds at the public's expense. We see that in many countries. These are the villains. But we also see how public officials are bribed to aid essentially terrorist organizations, to enable them to launder money through the international financial system, to get weapons, to get access, to break security codes, and so forth. So we are talking about corruption in terms not only of just cash and the dangers of distorting public budgets, increasing poverty, increasing hardship. We are also talking about it as a threat to global security.
Now you're looking not only at issues of corruption in terms of having to bribe policemen, but things that go into access to medical care, to access to being able to get people into schools, to getting their children into schools.
I first encountered this in the worst possible way, I think, when I was a spokesman for the World Bank in the 1980s, and I went to the first ever international conference on maternal health care in Nairobi in Kenya. And after that conference, we went out to various villages. And it was horrendous to see how women who desperately needed health care were not able to get it because they couldn't pay the bribes for the nurses and the doctors at the clinics in nearby towns. But they weren't that near, so they needed to get transportation. And they didn't have the money to bribe the public transportation people in order to get them to the clinics. This was horrendous. We see corruption affecting every sector: housing, medicine, education, sanitation. But let's never lose sight of the fact that it starts at the top. If governments are corrupt at the top, then it becomes pervasive throughout the governmental system. We see that in many countries today. We see that China is really struggling right now with corruption in the political system itself. We see it in Russia. And then everywhere we're also seeing more and more people becoming engaged. Because today, in this hyperactive, hyper-connected world of the internet and social media, more people are becoming more aware of corruption and more aware of what they can do about it. And my book also not only deals with all the problems, and they are huge, but it also deals with all of the things that are being done today to try and change this to the point where we can reach a tipping point. And I think in some countries we have, maybe in India, for example, a tipping point where you can start to talk about sustainable efforts to curb corruption.
Now, in terms of efforts to try to curb corruption, it would seem one way is to try to beef up public prosecution, try to beef up transparency issues so that people could be held accountable for what they do with the public monies they have. But it seemed that there might be other ways of also trying to approach it, which is to reduce the control and the power that government officials have over the things people do in their daily lives, so that people don't have to get endless numbers of certificates and things signed, that there are opportunities for bribery.
You're absolutely right. I mean, red tape is the prime part of the toolkit of the petty bureaucrat as a means of extorting bribes. Oh, you've got to fill out this form. You've got to meet this regulation. Give me some cash. I'll pave the way. But it's more serious than that. We need to strengthen institutions of government. When you have an independent judiciary, when you have public prosecutors who are not fearful of being prosecuted themselves or thrown into prison, when you have freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, when you have the freedom of people to get information. Let me give you one example. The Partnership for Transparency Fund is one of many non-governmental organizations that supports anti-corruption efforts. In India last year, it supported 14 different organizations in different parts of the country to help women learn how to use the Freedom of Information Act. Why? So that they could then go to the municipal building, talk to the public officials and say, we want to see the employment roles that you have here, because we have vouchers that say we are entitled to a job, but we never get the job. So let's see the municipal roles, let's see who's getting the jobs. And what do they find? They find that half the people who are there supposedly enjoying those jobs are dead. That the officials have put in the names of dead people so the officials could steal the wages. When you have a powerful Freedom of Information Act and you have ordinary people who learn how to use it, you already can start to roll back the proclivity, the propensity to bribe.
Well, Frank Vogl, thanks so much for joining us. Frank Vogl is author of the new book, Waging War on Corruption. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.